Hey everybody, I'm just gonna go through a couple slides of notes regarding the menstrual cycle because that's the lab that you're going to be working on next. So we previously talked in our notes about the male reproductive system, organs, the function of those organs, and we also talked about the female reproductive system, the various organs and what they do. So we're going to move on and start talking about the process of fertilization and development and birth. And so we're going to start by talking about the female reproductive cycle, or what we would call the menstrual cycle. And so the menstrual cycle is a cycle that is controlled by various hormones that are produced within a woman's body once she reaches puberty. And so a typical reproductive cycle lasts about 28 days, but it varies. It can vary pretty significantly from one person to another. It starts at puberty, and eventually it will end at menopause when a woman is reached the end of her reproductive years and no longer is ovulating. And the reproductive cycle varies. It can change throughout a woman's life. It can be longer, shorter. It might stop during certain times. Stress, exercise, age, all sorts of different factors can influence this cycle. And so, as I said, the cycle is controlled by uh, basically four hormones that um, are produced in different parts of the body, which control and trigger different things to happen within this stage. And so we're going to talk about each of those stages. The first, if we start at the beginning of the cycle, we can start with the follicle stage, which is a stage that lasts for about 10 to 14 days. The follicle stage is controlled by a special hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. It's abbreviated FSH. It's actually a hormone that's produced in a gland that's in the base of the brain. It's called the pituitary gland. And when levels of follicle stimulating hormone increase in a woman's blood, because the pituitary is making this hormone, pumping it into the blood, that blood, as we talked about with the endocrine system, the hormones in the blood eventually reaches the ovaries, and it triggers, because the ovaries have receptors for FSH, it triggers some things to happen within the ovaries. What happens is a follicle, which is sort of a little um, cavity within the ovary that contains the immature eggs. Follicle stimulating hormone triggers one of those follicles to start to mature. It grows larger. The egg cell that's inside of it begins to mature as well. And as this follicle is growing, it's also producing its own hormones. It's producing estrogen, another hormone that's important in the reproductive cycle. And the effect of estrogen, that hormone affects the lining of the uterus. It causes the inside of the uterus to thicken. It causes an increase in the development of blood vessels. And really, what's happening in the body is it's preparing for an embryo to implant, it's preparing for pregnancy. Around the 14th day, there's a hormone called luteinizing hormone, and it starts to be produced in increasing levels in the pituitary gland. And the levels of luteinizing hormone, LH, FSH, and estrogen all trigger the follicle to actually release this mature egg cell. And so the egg cell emerges from the ovary and starts to travel down the oviduct after ovulation. And this is the time when a woman can become pregnant. Okay, if there are sperm present around this ovulation stage, they can make their way to the egg cell and eventually fertilize it. After ovulation, the follicle that has just released its egg starts to change. It changes into a mass called the corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum starts producing its own hormones called progesterone. Okay? And this progesterone prevents new follicles from maturing. And progesterone also maintains the lining of the uterus, keeps it thickened, keeps it with new blood vessels developing. Again, this process is to support an embryo, which is going to eventually implant there within the uterus if a woman becomes pregnant. If she doesn't become pregnant, then if there's no sperm to fertilize the egg, than the final stage, which is the menstrual stage, makes. And in the menstrual stage, the lining of the uterus um, starts to break down, okay? And it is released from the body through the vagina. And so the lining of the uterus, along with the flow of blood from those blood vessels that were growing there, is released, and that's the menstrual period. Okay? And it is released through the vagina, and then the cycle begins again. And so this process repeats once every month or so, of eggs maturing, being released during ovulation, the uterine lining being enriched with blood vessels, and if there is no fertilized egg, then the lining is shed. And we can see this slide presents some of the detail of that. And so what we see, and you're going to be working with graphing of these hormones. What we see here on the right is a complex sort of diagram showing the feedback of FSH and LH are the two hormones produced in the pituitary gland. Again, that's in the brain. And estrogen and progesterone are produced by the ovaries. And all of these hormones together help to keep this cycle in sync. We can see in these graphs there are changes to a woman's body temperature as she goes through different phases in her menstrual cycle. In fact, some women, if they're trying to become pregnant, will track their body temperature, because when there's a spike in body temperature, that's around the time of ovulation. And so then a woman's most likely to be pregnant if she has sex when she's ovulating. So we see the hormone levels changing throughout the reproductive cycle. Here we can see what's happening in the ovary. We can see the follicle growing. We see during ovulation an egg being released, and then the corpus luteum stages. And also at the end, in the bottom, we can see what's happening inside of the uterus. We can see the lining of the uterus is being shed, and then in the subsequent stages, it's thickening, getting ready for pregnancy. So you're going to be doing a lab. I'm going to show you this. You're going to be doing this lab now. And there's a little introduction which sort of reviews some of the things that I just talked about. And also, you're going to be graphing. And so I'm going to show you what this looks like, because it's a little different. So what you have here are the four hormones I just mentioned: FSH, follicle stimulating hormone; estrogen, luteinizing hormone; and progesterone. And in gray, these are the days of the cycle. And so you're going to be graphing this data, and you're going to be doing it on a set of axes that looks like this. So graph A, this one, are going to be the two hormones that are produced in the pituitary gland. And so that's FSH, which you see here, and LH, which you see here. What you'll notice is there's different scales because these hormones are found in much different concentrations. So when you're graphing FSH, you're going to be using the scale on the left side, and you're going to graph FSH over these 28 days. On the same grid, you're also going to graph LH. But when you're graphing the LH, you're going to be looking at the right side, the scale on the right side, to graph those hormones. You're also going to do the same thing with the ovarian hormones. Okay, that's estrogen and progesterone. The scale for estrogen is on the left. The scale for progesterone is on the right. So each of these graphs is going to have two lines, two different colors, each indicating the hormones that are changing. You also can see in these diagrams the changes that are happening in the ovary. This is the follicle developing. And then here we can see what's happening inside of the uterus. And after you've made your graphs, you have several questions that you're going to be answering about the reproductive cycle down here. So that's what we're going to be working on. I hope you're all doing well. I will hopefully be back in school very, very soon. So thanks for listening.